On September 9, 1945, Japan won the Sino-Japanese War against China. Korea was then part of the Japanese Empire until the end of World War II. When the Japanese surrendered after the war, it was up to the USA to take over the administration side of Korea. However, the Soviet Union also wanted the land they thought they earned after the Russo-Japanese War. The 38th parallel is the border that divides North Korea and South Korea. It has a latitude of 38 degrees north. Even though it was created in 1945, it is still acting as a border today. There is a concrete border that directly divides the North and South. At one side there are North Korean soldiers and on the other there are South Korean soldiers. In the August of 1945, a little while after the end of World War II, the Japanese surrendered after an atomic bombing, which marked the end of the war. This was when the 38th parallel was established. The parallel separates the Korean peninsula into the Soviet Administrative Zone and the American Zone. This barrier was broken by the American and South Korean military in 1951 during the Korean War. The Korean War started when around 75,000 North Korean soldiers crossed the 38th parallel and entered South Korea. On March 20, 1951, the UN ground forces started moving north of South Korea. The regimental combat team then parachuted past the boundary lines into North Korea. The mission was called Operation Tomahawk. The plan was to seize an area of land near the middle of North Korea on the Imjin River near Munsan. There were 3,300 parachuters who were dropped into North Korea on Good Friday. Once the parachuters were dropped, the planes started dropping heavier equipment that were attached to parachutes. The parachuters then reassembled on the ground with their equipment. The tanks of the 14th Division started to arrive, and they took their equipment off of the parachutes. Then the task force loaded their equipment up, and they kept moving north. The 24th Division foot troops started walking through the hills, while the rest of the 24th Division dropped napalm bombs by the enemy hideouts in the hills. Napalm bombs are also called fire bombs. They are usually made up of gasoline or jet fuel. This makes them easier to explode and ignite. According to Private First Class Jim Bynes,
about the only thing can get down into them is napalm. Burn them out.
The units then reorganized and prepared to cross the Imjin River. On the south bank, South Korean soldiers assembled while they waited for their assault boats to arrive. While waiting, they inspected and plotted areas of suspected enemies. Before the troops crossed the river, to ensure their safety, they fire north across the river to the areas they plotted earlier. They do this just to make sure that there are no more enemies on the other side of the river before they cross. Immediately after they fire across to the north, the ROK troops got into their assault ships and started paddling across. The bank of the river on the north side was already checked for enemies before they crossed. Another time when the 38th parallel was crossed is when the Tank Infantry Patrol located north of Seoul, South Korea were ordered to cross as well. After they were told their plan, they gave out extra HE grenades for safety. The following morning, the troops mounted tanks to ride during the group's advance. They then crossed the Imjin River, but had to be careful. Once they crossed enemy lines, the roads were full of landmines. So they drove the tanks close to the bank of the Imjin River. They drove in shallow water. Once they officially reached North Korean land, they got off the tanks and proceeded by foot. They then walked through the hills where the enemy is dug into. They used the grenades that they passed out earlier to defend themselves from the enemies in the hills. They then keep moving forward. As they are advancing, there are a few enemies along the way shooting from the sides. This slows them down a bit, but they don't want to stop to get involved. It is more important to keep moving forward than to have side battles. Along the way, they came across a small communist village. To make sure there were no enemies present, they shot down the village. Then they continued to their safety base. The troops were told to clear some area near the 38th parallel for troops who might need to cross later. They also had to search the roads for landmines. They loaded their weapons, checked their equipment, and mounted their tanks. While traveling down the road, they had to watch out for any nearby enemies trying to attack. To get through dangerous roads, they drove their tanks through shallow streams to avoid landmines. Then they continued to look for the landmines. Since most of the bridges were destroyed in the area, they drove the tanks through a nearby village. In 1953, President Eisenhower threatened that the American troops would use nuclear weapons against North Korea soon. The worry about this being true led to an agreement made by the Americans, South Koreans, North Koreans, and China, which ended the war in July of 1953.